now we have the chance to hear from Ben Spackman. He's a historian of religion, science, and scriptural interpretation. And his formal studies include ancient Near Eastern history, ancient Semitic languages, and American religious history. His doctoral dissertation examines the Latter-day Saint conflict between evolution and creationism in the 20th century. And today we hear from him about science and scripture, friends, enemies, or others.
My title reflects a common concern among Latter-day Saints and Christians in general. How should we understand the relationship between scripture and science? How do we make sense of questions about the age of the earth, fossils, dinosaurs, the origins of humans, and evolution, when scripture and science seem to conflict? As Latter-day Saints, how do we make sense of the similarities and the differences between Genesis, the books of Moses and Abraham, and the temple? I want to set expectations appropriately here. I recently finished teaching an institute class called Genesis and the Doctrine of Creation. We spent 12 weeks, 2 hours each week, on the first 12 chapters of Genesis. And we did not run out of things to say. Ancient contexts of in different time periods, LDS historical and American, but more important, list key the nation, prophets, scripture, and interpreting scripture. Today, in such a short time, only touch on a little bit of. So I'm going to talk briefly history of science and religion, particularly the books, because of those issues of the age of the earth and evolution. My hope is that whatever specific issues or problems we might have with scripture and science, larger questions will help. So first, brief note, categories and definitions of religion and science. And here in English, when I say science, I don't know if Wissenschaft or not better in German as a translation of the word, especially in translation. And religion and the boundary between them have changed considerably over time. What this means, for example, is that great scientists, okay, I see. I haven't looked at my slides for a while. Great scientists like Isaac Newton and Johannes Kepler, they did not think of themselves as scientists, or that they were doing science, not religion. They thought they were studying God through nature. Newton was deeply religious and wrote far more about the Bible and theology and church history than he did about calculus and gravity. Kepler was trying to figure out the divine harmonies of God in the universe and discovered elliptical planetary orbits and mathematical laws along the way. It was not until the 1800s that science became, first of all, distinct from religion. It became secular in the sense of separate from theology, separate from religion, not atheistic per se. It became professional. That is, science was no longer something you did as a wealthy gentleman, as a hobby. It became something you did as a job, as a career. And that meant that it also became expert. It required specialized training, degrees, professional memberships, and so on. Lastly, science also became experimental, systematically observational, quantified. All of this happened very fast in the 1800s. These categories of science and religion and how we think of them in relation to each other have changed greatly over time. The changes in the 1800s greatly narrowed the definition and practice of science. At the same time that the nature of science was changing, its perceived relationship to religion was changing. And one particular understanding of that relationship came to dominate public understanding, at least in America, something like this. Science and religion have always been the same throughout history. They are fixed concepts. Science and religion are now and have always been and always will be at war with each other. And ultimately, rational science will triumph over irrational religion, and religion will disappear. Historians have called this the conflict thesis, or the warfare hypothesis, and they have demonstrated how these four ideas are deeply flawed. You can see their frustration in the title of this book, The Warfare Between Science and Religion, the Idea That Would Not Die. Historians would like this idea to die because it's not a useful one, and it's not a true one. Nevertheless, the conflict thesis remains kind of the default understanding of your average American, and it's particularly popular among atheists. Regardless of the relationship between science and religion, real or imagined, there has been a fairly consistent model of the relationship between science and Christian scripture. For almost 2,000 years, many Christians have held to a particular model relating scripture and nature to each other called the two books model. That is, from the 4th century onwards, Christians talked about both the book of scripture and the book of nature. Both books had to be studied and interpreted by humans. Both books came from God, and both books revealed God, although in different ways. Scripture was sometimes called direct revelation, and nature indirect revelation. As God's creation, nature testified of the Creator. Psalm 19, for example, says, "The heavens declare God's glory, and the sky the work of his hands." Or think of Alma in the Book of Mormon, who says, "All things denote there is a God. Even the earth and all things that are upon the face of it do witness that there is a supreme creator." This two books model was very popular, but especially and particularly among geologists from the 1600s onwards. Elder James E. Talmage received a PhD in geology before he became an apostle in 1911. Note the title of his first book in 1888, The First Book of Nature. Now, this idea that God had given two books to humans and they could not ultimately disagree with each other became inverted, distorted. It was made instead to say the two books did not disagree because they were saying the same thing. We have a term for this in English, but very few people know it, and I don't know what he will translate as, but it's called concordism. The idea that scripture and science must be in concord, in agreement with each other, that they are not in conflict because they are saying the same thing. This idea of concordism distorted our understanding of scripture. Concordism established a direct link, an intellectual drive shaft between science and scripture. Whatever one said, the other also had to be saying. This drive shaft could be turned from either direction, either science dominating the meaning of scripture or scripture dominating scientific interpretation. Let's look at an example. In the 1600s in Denmark, Niels Stinson, Latinized as Nicholas Steno, observed layers of rock on top of each other on the coast. He realized that the layers of rock on top must be younger than the layers of rock underneath. And this suggested that the Earth was quite old given the number of layers. Steno also did work on fossils and determined that fossils were the remains of long dead animals, which was a new idea. Prior to this, people had thought that fossils were tricks of nature. Steno is the father of modern geology and modern paleontology. And at a certain point, Steno also converted to Catholicism, became a Catholic bishop, and then after his death was granted Beatus status, which as I understand it is one level below being a Catholic saint. Which demonstrates in part that the Catholic Church was not opposed to science per se. That's part of the warfare, bad history. But starting with Steno, as more and more discoveries started to suggest that the Earth was not just old, but very old, because of concordism, the assumption that science and Scripture must say the same thing, interpreters of the Bible began to interpret Genesis differently. We are all familiar with the structure of Genesis chapter 1 with its 7-day organization. In Christian history, there had been a variety of views of what these days meant. Some, like Origen of Alexandria, an early Christian theologian, and St. Augustine, both argued that creation was instantaneous. But God or Moses had arranged it into a 7-day story so that humans could understand. Nobody in Christian history made the length of a creation day in Genesis a very big deal. It just wasn't a terribly important question. But with concordism and geology, suddenly the days of Genesis became a point of argument. If science and Scripture had to say the same thing, and if the earth was very old, then Genesis had to say it was old. And so a few different interpretations of the days of Genesis appeared to make Scripture square with science. There is the very common idea called the day-age interpretation. And I think I've gotten behind on my slides. Here we are. The day-age interpretation has a day in Genesis meaning an indefinite period of time, a very long length, an eon, undetermined period of time. In this understanding, Genesis teaches an old earth because it does not assign any length or period of time to creation. Each day in Genesis can be millions or billions of years, whatever science needs, because science is driving the interpretation. This makes Genesis have the earth be very old and removes any apparent conflict. And this, by the way, seems to be the interpretation of day that we find in the book of Abraham, in which each occurrence of the word day is replaced by time. But Moses still says day, like the book of Genesis. It is likely that Joseph Smith's Hebrew teacher in Kirtland held to the day-age view and taught it to Joseph. And we know that the book of Abraham reflects some of his Hebrew training. Now, I've talked about this in depth at the Fair Conference. You can read this text, you can watch this in English. If someone wants to translate some of this material into German, just let me know and we'll coordinate. So Latter-day Saints are fairly familiar with this interpretation of day-age. There also used to be a very popular position called the gap interpretation, or the ruin and restoration interpretation. This squared Genesis with science by saying that the days of Genesis were indeed each a 24-hour day, but that the first 2 verses of Genesis referred to an earlier creation. It became formless and void in the language of Genesis. That is, evil and fallen, and so God destroyed it. And then between verse 1 and 2, or perhaps verse 2 and 3, this interpretation sees a massive gap of geological age, billions of years. In this interpretation, all of the fossils of dinosaurs and humanoids would be part of that first creation in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Now, a few Latter-day Saints preached something like this idea, which I have explored elsewhere. Both the day-age and gap interpretations operate on the assumption that science and Scripture must be saying the same thing. Since science says the earth is old, Genesis must also somehow say the earth is old. So the days of Genesis must be interpreted in a way for Genesis to express or allow for an old earth. Science is driving the interpretation of Genesis. As I said above, the drive shaft of concordism that connects science to Scripture can be turned from the other direction. There is another interpretation which also assumes concordism, but goes the other way, in which Scripture determines science. In America and in the church, particularly, I'll leave that. Some people have said, well, Genesis says days, and Scripture must be true, so the earth must have been created in a short period of time. Therefore, since science and Scripture must say the same thing, any science that says the earth is old is mistaken science, or false science, or a conspiracy. This was a very popular LDS interpretation. Now, I'm sure you've all heard some variation of these. All are based on the assumption of concordism. Now we must ask the question, is concordism a valid assumption? In the last 200 years, there has been a massive rediscovery of the ancient Near East, of the historical, linguistic, and cultural context of the Israelites and the Old Testament. We know far more of Israel's neighbors, their beliefs, religion, texts, and cultures than we used to. That new context has changed our understanding of what ancient creation texts were trying to do. Explaining the physical origins and age of the universe, that is, scientific or natural origins, was not their primary purpose. How do we know this? In 1876, the first account of a Babylonian text called Enuma Elish appeared in English, titled The Chaldean Account of Genesis. This Babylonian creation text has several parallels to Genesis, and scholars at that time assumed Enuma Elish was doing the same thing Genesis was trying to do, and so they gave it that title. As time went on, and Enuma Elish and other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts were discovered and studied closely, the titles given to Enuma Elish began to change. By the 1950s, one scholar referred to it as the so-called Babylonian creation epic to indicate some doubt that it was really about creation. By the 1990s, scholarly understanding had matured further. Yes, Enuma Elish did have an account of creation, but providing scientific details about creation did not seem to be its purpose. What then? The text describes how a young powerful deity named Marduk agreed to vanquish a watery deity named Tiamat, along with her minions, including a dragon or great serpent. In return for defeating Tiamat, Marduk would become king of the gods. Marduk defeats Tiamat and her minions and creates the cosmos out of her watery body. Now, if any of that sounds vaguely familiar, it is because the Bible has echoes of this story, such as in Isaiah with Leviathan and Rahab and the twisting serpent. These are some of the names given to Tiamat's minions, her helpers. In the book of Revelation, God defeats his cosmic watery enemy depicted as a great sea creature. This is Gustave Doré depicting this battle in the book of Revelation, but this could be a painting of Enuma Elish and Babylon as well, because that is ultimately where this imagery comes from. As it turns out, the purpose of Enuma Elish, its focus, its point, is to explain how Marduk became king of the gods. And so some scholars now title Enuma Elish the exaltation of Marduk, the rise of Marduk, the ascension of Marduk, because that is what the text is really about. The new title reflects our best understanding of what the text is actually trying to do, and it is not explain creation. Well, if Enuma Elish describes creation, but only by way of explaining and justifying how Marduk became king of the gods, is it possible Genesis chapter 1 has a purpose other than telling us about the scientific history of the earth? Indeed, it does. If we read Genesis against our modern background of scientific material understandings of origins, certain things appear to us to be very much in conflict, and we try to mess with that with concordism. But that is not the right background to read it against. Rather, we should read Genesis in its ancient Near Eastern context and background against other creation stories like Enuma Elish, because the Israelites knew these stories. The goal of Genesis 1 is to affirm and teach three things that were deeply in conflict for the Israelites. First of all, what is the nature of creation? Second, what is the nature of the deity in charge, the deity who created? And third, what is the place of humans in this creation? In Enuma Elish, creation is secondary to the battle of the gods for kingship. By contrast, in Genesis, creation is deliberate and planned. In Enuma Elish, the gods do not care about humans, and their place in creation is to function as slaves to the lowest tier of deities. By contrast, Genesis affirms multiple times that creation is good. It is good. It is good. And on day 6, when humans are created, it is very good. In Enuma Elish, the universe is run by gods who do not care about humans, who may do battle with each other, who may get old or die. By contrast, Genesis teaches creation by a single mind, without any divine battle. Indeed, in Genesis, we have several distinct hints drawing a direct contrast with Enuma Elish. Marduk must battle Tiamat, a watery female deity, to become king and create. Tiamat is cognate with the Hebrew word tahom, which is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, translated in English as the deep. And I failed to make a slide for this, although I have a transition written into my notes here. Unlike Enuma Elish, God does not do battle with the deep in Genesis. This cognate term, the watery Tiamat tahom, is simply present and subservient to the God of Israel and obeys his command. Similarly, in Enuma Elish, Tiamat had helpers, minions, fellow battle soldiers. These are reflected in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21 as the Taninim, which the King James Version in English, the official Bible of the church, translated as great whales because they did not have access to Enuma Elish for another couple hundred years. Today, most translations go with great sea monsters because of the parallels to Enuma Elish. Slower? Okay. I feel like I'm going at a snail's pace, but that speaks to how lightning I usually am. These Taninim, these great sea monsters in Genesis, are simply subservient creations to the God of Israel, not rivals who must be defeated before creation can occur. To Israelites, surrounded by much, much larger and more powerful and polytheistic empires like Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt, these doctrines in Genesis were central and crucial. The world is good. The deity who created it did so deliberately and with purpose, with humans as the crowning creation, and God cares deeply about it. Particularly around the time of Lehi, when Babylon would destroy Jerusalem and haul most of the Israelites off to Babylon, these affirmations become important. And this brings me back to the 7-day structure of Genesis 1. What is the function of those days in the text? If you suspect at this point that the structure of days serves a theological or ritual or mythical purpose and not a scientific one, you are correct. Israelites had two kinds of abstract holiness. They had sacred space, that is, the temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But they also had sacred time, that is, the seventh day, the Sabbath. After the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, sacred space was no longer available to them. If Israelite priests in Babylon wanted to counter the doctrines of Enuma Elish with the teachings of Israelite doctrine about the nature of deity and creation, what better way to do it than to put it in a structure of 7 days and emphasize sacred time? God created in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Similarly, Israelites in Babylon could work on 6 days and rest on the seventh. To put this differently, I would argue that the days in Genesis are indeed 24-hour days. But that does not mean anything for science. Their purpose is ritual and theological, not scientific or historical. I want to close by quoting from two apostles and an American Bible scholar named Conrad Hyers. In 1931, the first presidency had Elder James E. Talmage give a public speech to provide balance to a public talk given by Elder Joseph Fielding Smith. Elder Smith was very much a young earth creationist. He believed that creation happened in a short time. The earth was young. There was no death before 6,000 years ago. Evolution was satanic, and he preached this frequently and loudly. Smith was a concordist. He thought that Scripture should control science. He also argued that mainstream science was irrelevant to these questions. I do not care what the scientists say, he preached in this talk. Smith's speech did not reflect the views of other church leaders, including the first presidency. And so to provide public balance, Elder Talmage spoke on science and religion. Again, he was both an apostle and a PhD in geology, so he had different kinds of authority. The speech, called Earth and Man, was distributed by the tens of thousands of copies in America, England, and it was translated into German in 1931 and printed in Der Stern. You can probably find it somewhere. In that speech, Elder Talmage said that science was reliable, the earth was very old, life and death had been going on for millions of years, and there were human-like creatures long before Adam. More importantly, he said, the accounts of science and scripture cannot be fundamentally opposed. One cannot contradict the other, though man's interpretation of either may be seriously at fault. He thought Smith misinterpreted scripture by reading it as science. Around the same time, Apostle Stephen L. Richards preached in General Conference, the revelations of the new dispensation, as well as those of the Bible, were in the beginning and are now interpreted by men, and men interpret in the light of experience and understanding. In the interpretation of scripture and doctrine, they, and he's speaking specifically about church leaders here, not people outside the church. In the interpretation of scripture and doctrine, they are dependent on their knowledge and experience. Old conceptions and traditional interpretations must be influenced by newly discovered evidence. Not that ultimate fact and law change, but our understanding varies with our education and experience. We know much, much more about Genesis and the ancient Near East today than we did 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago. And this brings me to Conrad Hyers, who was not a Latter-day Saint, but was a good Bible scholar who wrote a good bit about Genesis and the ancient Near East. Hyers said, and this is probably too small for you to read, it may surely be said that the Genesis accounts of creation are not in conflict with scientific and historical knowledge. Yet this is not because they can be shown to be in conformity with this knowledge, but precisely because they have little to do with it. Genesis and science are not really in conflict because what Genesis is trying to assert is not primarily scientific knowledge. Scripture and science are different things, and as Latter-day Saints, we can enthusiastically affirm them both, provided we understand and interpret them correctly. That requires both good information and a large dose of intellectual humility. Thank you. And I think we do have time for questions, yes? No one has questions about scripture and science? Yes, hold please.
Because you brought up so many different names that we haven't had before.
Yes.
My question is, how would you interpret Abraham issues where he takes his only son and sacrifices it?
Genesis 22 is not really within the scope of my talk or science, so I'd prefer not to address it.
Okay.
I have written about it online, but that's not really a science and scripture question.
No, because there's a part, like if you read the Judaism's books, it says that, for example, Abraham had taken his son, sacrifices, because he was not rational.
Oh, I see, you're talking about the origins of the text.
Yeah, because you brought up so many different
Yes.
words that are old enough.
Very generally, virtually everything we have in the Old Testament started as a oral tradition. That is, none of the texts in the Old Testament started
because
with
my
a
question
prophet
will
sitting down
will
and
go
writing
after
it
that
out.
one. That's why I wanted to know. But if you cannot answer, then I'm going to skip the question.
Yeah, let's pass.
I just wanted to know if this can be found online under FAIR.
All of my FAIR talks, I have, I think, 4 or 5. They're all online under FAIR. They're on YouTube.
And which one is this, basically? Do you know what it's called?
The one talking about Genesis, Moses, Abraham, and the temple is called A Paradoxical Preservation of Faith. Clever subtitle. I don't remember. I think it's 2019. I have 2017, 2019, 2021, and I think 2022. But they're all on YouTube.
I just have one question that's more about the explaining of things.
Yes.
How would you, in a short explanation, explain that to a 12-year-old, the context of creation and evolution? My daughter, she's turned 12 today, coming home from school, talking about evolution and creation. So I understand the talk, but how concise or how quickly can it be explained to a young youth, for example? Do you have any ideas there? Any suggestions?
Are you
I
familiar
can't
with?
have you listen to the talk. That's
Are you familiar with the French artist René Magritte? Have you ever seen the painting of the pipe, and underneath it says in French, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." This is not a pipe. It's not a pipe. It's a painting. It looks like a pipe, but it's not a pipe. When we read Genesis today, or Moses, or Abraham, or the temple, because of our collection of assumptions that tend to be oriented towards science, material, and very far away from questions of, say, polytheism, we want to read Genesis as answering those questions that we have. We are essentially looking at that painting and say, no, that's a pipe. That's not a painting, that's a pipe. And it's not, it's a painting. In other words, creation-evolution conflict is a category error. It is assuming that both things are apples, when in reality one is apples and one is oranges. But you don't understand that until you start to read Genesis in ancient Near Eastern context. And that is not something that is apparent to us, especially because in the church we tend to think that Scripture, especially the Bible, is understandable without reference to anything outside of Scripture. Genesis 1 verse 1 should be just as clear to me in translation as it was to an Israelite 3,000 years ago. And the reason why that doesn't work is because everything that we speak is set within a shared framework of assumptions. And if we change those assumptions, it no longer makes sense. For example, if I get up and I say, I usually use this example in America, and it doesn't work because I'm in Europe. But I say, I went to Paris last month, and I took a plane. And by the way, a plane is a very fast vehicle that flies through the air. I don't have to explain that because we have a shared conception. Now, what happens if I'm talking to someone who does not have that shared conception and I don't explain it? Multiply that by 1,000, and you have the book of Genesis. That's it in a nutshell.
So my question would be, what are good resources to start at? What are good commentaries on the Old Testament?
Everything I will recommend is in English. Unfortunately, German language does not have a good history of Bible scholarship. That's a very bad joke, by the way. Germans pioneered modern Bible scholarship. Yeah, there are always issues of translation. Translation is not the major issue, though. Most modern Bible translations, whether English or German, will translate the words just fine. What you need translated, though, is that web of shared assumptions and background knowledge that is not embedded in those words. For that, I would recommend something called a study Bible. Study Bibles, they are normal Bible translations, but they have extensive footnotes, they have essays. In English, I tend to recommend the Jewish Study Bible from the Jewish Publication Society. I can recommend lots of stuff by American English-speaking scholars. The most accessible for Latter-day Saints is probably my material on YouTube, on my website. It's benspackman.com. It's just my name. Some of that has started to be translated into Spanish by people in Mexico who contacted me and said, this is fantastic material. Can we translate it into Spanish? And I said, absolutely, that'd be wonderful. That's kind of weird, but great. About what? I don't understand. Torah. Yeah, I mean, Torah is just a Hebrew word. It's either the first 5 books of the Old Testament or... I am still not following your question. Yes, but you need to connect it for me, not just give me a Hebrew word to riff on.
No, it's just there's no about Hebrews. It's just there's so much to learn about it, which because it's the ancients. Your presentation, there's so much about all.
It was very compact. Learning biblical languages is not magic. It's less about the language and more about the historical and cultural contexts. I've done a lot of Hebrew. I've also done Aramaic and Assyrian and Babylonian. You don't need to learn the languages to understand Scripture well. You just need the tools that give you meaning and background.
And that's the tools that we need, and those are the ones.
Study Bibles, various kinds of commentaries. There is a little bit of material like this that is potentially coming out from the church in the next couple of years. I have seen a very early draft, but I don't know what it will look like. But Come Follow Me started pointing in this direction, actually. The signs were there for those of us who could read the tea leaves. Question in the back.
So many questions, but just one. As far as I understand, Joseph Smith read the Bible, the Old Testament, and understood it generally literally. My question is, for me personally, maybe for other people as well, if I wrestle with that idea of the Old Testament, specifically being so literal, to what extent is that a problem?
Well, you've put a lot in that question. First of all, the idea of literal interpretation is a very flawed one. Latter-day Saints, at least in English, have often approached Scripture with a binary, that it's literal or it's figurative. And that's a very false binary, and it's very easy to point out. Do you have Netflix here in Germany? Of course you have Netflix here in Germany. When you open up Netflix, does it present you with the option of, do you want to watch a literal movie or a figurative movie? What does it present you with? A whole lot of different options, which at least in English we call genre. Borrowing the French, is that Gattung in German? Yeah. When we approach Scripture thinking that it falls into one of 2 categories, literal or figurative, we are trying to shoehorn everything into a false binary. Scripture is, I never thought I'd say this sentence, Scripture is a lot like Netflix. It has a lot of different genres within it. It has songs, it has poetry, it has letters, it has fiction, it has historical fiction, it has nonfiction, it has instructions for building a building, it has myth and ritual, it has all kinds of things. When I say that Come Follow Me was a big change, there was one line in Come Follow Me that said something like, understanding what kind of passage we're reading will help us understand the meaning. That is, it was saying very gently, if you understand the genre, you know how to process the information correctly. Excuse me. And if you misunderstand the genre, you're going to get it wrong. If we read Genesis as if it belongs to the genre of natural science, we are wresting Scripture. We are misunderstanding. If we read Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan as an actual historical story of a Good Samaritan, and Jesus' point is to make sure we know that historical story, we have misunderstood the genre, and by misunderstanding the genre, we misunderstand the purpose, the point. And so when you say literal reading, first of all, I just go like this inside, and I think that's a whole, that's another hour lecture. Now, let's assume we do read Scripture literally, as if everything in it must be history and science and accurate, which is a kind of fundamentalism. The risk there is that by falsely creating conflict with science, we end up choosing our own understanding of Scripture over science that may help us. And we've seen this in the US recently, where there was research that showed people who were young earth creationists and anti-evolution, because they thought that's what Scripture required, were also anti-vaccine. Because the feelings about science being unreliable that they got from literal reading of Scripture carried over into their health decisions. For many people, it can lead to loss of faith because they feel forced to choose between science and Scripture. And I have talked to a number of people who have ended up as atheists because they read Scripture literally and they were convinced that that was what God had revealed, that's what prophets taught, and if that was it, then they chose science, because science you could prove. And there's all kinds of problems with that attitude, but literal reading of Scripture has very real risks. Other questions? I assume we'll run out of time at some point. I can keep going. Yes?
I would be interested in, like, most of the scholarship on the creation is on Genesis, but we as Latter-day Saints, we have, as you said, 2 to 3 more accounts of this. In your study of it, what is something that maybe we as Latter-day Saints have, because there's nuance changes, some is similar, but there's also some substantial differences between those. What have you felt that is that God has added to us, like has given us, like as maybe as a special call, that because we have those additional accounts of the creation? So
this is a good question. It's not a fair talk, but I have a fireside on YouTube that's an hour long that addresses this. But let me try to summarize a little bit. What I see happening in Moses, Abraham, and the temple is prophethood in action. That is, Joseph is wrestling with a particular problem. He is trying to seek revelation. He is trying to make it relevant to people in our day. What Joseph did with Genesis is, in some sense, what inspired ancient Israelites did with other creation accounts. They took things that had problems, and under inspiration, they transformed and adapted them into something that had relevance and goodness. And if I grab someone on the street in Salzburg and say, what does the Pneuma Elish mean to you for your daily life? They will say nothing. If I say, what about Genesis? They will probably say, well, nothing, because it's not even talking about science. Why should I care about some old myth? What Joseph did under inspiration was make it relevant and modern and applicable. That's my 30-second version. Okay, thank you much.